My name is Jake Grasberger, and today I'll be going over our craft beer case study. The agenda for today is we'll start off with a brief introduction, then we'll go into our analysis of breweries per state. We'll then talk about how we handled missing values in our data set, then dive into our analysis of ABV and IBU. We'll then go into our recommendation for Budweiser and close everything out with a nice summary. Here's the team that worked on this project. Again, my name is Jake Grasberger, my partner was Lee Ho. Our first analysis was on breweries per state. Before we go into any of that, though, we do have to address the fact that there was some duplicated breweries that in the data set that was given to us. You can see here the capital T versus the lowercase t. We did remove the duplication before we did any of our analysis, just to not double count anything. You can see here when we were looking at breweries per state, there is quite a lot of breweries in the northeastern part of the United States as well as along the West Coast, with major pockets of breweries being in Texas as well as Colorado. It's interesting to note Colorado is the highest, mainly because the state has very few restrictions on breweries, and a lot of microbreweries are opening there and creating new and interesting beers because there's so much less restrictions on them. So let's talk about how we handled missing data. The first thing we noticed when we got this data set in the beer side of things was there was a lot of missing values for both ABV and IBU. We decided that it wouldn't be fair to impute or exclude the missing values, mainly because certain breweries were missing all of the values for ABV and IBU, and it didn't seem to be missing at random enough for us. So we went out to external sources and pulled in that data as best we could. You can see here we filled in the ABV and IBU data, and if we were missing any ABV data, we decided to drop that from the data set, mainly because the data was either for charity events or special releases and seemed kind of out of the norm, and we didn't want to include it or try to impute it. For the missing IBU values, we did decide to impute those based on mean, just so we had a value there, and we imputed them based on style, which seemed like a good way to kind of categorize the different beers, or the IBUs. The total number of drop beers was 23, or about 1%. There was also some duplicated beers. You can see here, this Oberon beer has both 12 and 16 ounces. For our analysis, we didn't really do anything with ounces, so we decided to drop these so we didn't double count. There's also some beers with year in the name, and everything else was still the same. If this was the case, we also dropped that beer as well. There was also 3 beers that had missing styles, as well as ABV and IBU. Because there wasn't enough information to look up these beers, we decided to drop them from our data set. So now let's talk about ABV and IBU and our analysis there. First thing we did was break out the median ABV. For the overall country, it was 5.6%. You can see it broken down by state as well. It's interesting to look at Utah here. They have the lowest median ABV, mainly because in that state there are restrictions on how much or how high the alcohol content can be for beers, and so the breweries there are making relatively less high ABV beers than the rest of the country. For the median IBU, you can see again the median for the country is 33, broken out by state as well. It's interesting to look at West Virginia, which is such an outlier. There was only a couple beers from West Virginia in our data set, and they were extremely bitter beers. Looking specifically at the beer with the highest ABV value, it's from Colorado. Again, not as many restrictions there, and they created this, interesting beer with 12.8%. So super strong, but kind of interesting. The most bitter beer was coming from Oregon, another place where there's just quite a few breweries along the West Coast, and this one happened to have 138 IBU, so extremely bitter. Looking at the ABV summary, the distribution tends to be a little bit right skewed. It's really interesting when you break it down by beer type. IPA seems to be more normally distributed. Other ales and other beers tend to be a little more right skewed, which is kind of causing the overall data set to have that slight right skewness to it. When we look at the relationship between ABV and IBU, the evidence suggests that as you increase your IBU, the ABV tends to increase as well. Again, we broke it down by beer types in the bottom left corner of the screen, where each beer type kind of has a different relationship between the two, but there's always that general positive increase between IBU and ABV. It's also worth noting that there seems to be a soft cap around 0.1 ABV, and this is mainly due to restrictions among the states. To try to find a relationship between IPAs and other ales, we decided to use a K&N model. We decided to train the ranges of K from 1 to 20. After iterating over it, 200 times, we found the best value of K to be 5, and it gave us a pretty good accuracy at 90%, as well as sensitivity and specificity. Looking at the output of the model, there seems to us to be a clear trend where if you're below an IBU of 50, you tend to be an other ale, and if you're above that IBU of 50 line, you tend to be an IPA. Obviously there's some exclusions to that rule, but it seemed like a good rule of thumb for us, and our K&N classifier seemed to identify that as well. And this makes sense because IPAs tend to have more hops, which makes them a little more bitter, and they're also a little stronger, so it followed intuition as well. Now I'll go into our recommendation for Budweiser. Looking at the two really popular beers, IPAs and other ales, it looks like the southern part of the United States doesn't have as many of those type of beers, so maybe an underserved market, especially with both Florida and Georgia being in the southern part of the United States with the third and eighth highest population, so kind of an untapped market there. You can see here IPAs as well as other ales just tend to be underrepresented in this region. So our recommendation at Budweiser would be to release a new IPA or ale in this area where you won't face as much competition from local breweries and you can make some money. In summary, the breweries tend to be clustered along the eastern part of the United States as well as the West Coast, with major breweries being in Texas and Colorado as well. The evidence suggests to us that as IBU goes up, so does ABV. We also notice that the IBU tends to classify an IPA or an other ale, and our recommendation to Budweiser would be to release a new ale in either Florida or Georgia to avoid as much competition. Thank you for your time.